Hello, my name's Sonia Ali and I'm a specialist advisory teacher for Send Success, which is the Waltham Forest Send Outreach Service. This is the second in a series of webinars about dyslexia, and the focus of this webinar is spelling. The learning objectives of this webinar are to, first of all, understand why dyslexic pupils face additional challenges when learning to spell in English, to recognise the underlying principles of effective teaching of spelling, and also to be aware of some best practice strategies to use when teaching spelling to dyslexic pupils. So before we think about dyslexic pupils and the challenges that they might experience learning to spell, I'd like us to consider the intrinsic challenges of learning to spell in the English language. As you know, there are 26 letters in the English alphabet, but there are approximately 44 phonemes. So phonemes are the sounds in a language. In comparison, other languages like Spanish and Italian have a much more consistent letter-sound correspondence. So there are approximately the same number of letters in the alphabet as there are sounds. So in Spanish, for example, there are 27 letters in the alphabet and approximately 25 phonemes or sounds. So spelling in those languages isn't really an issue because there's a very consistent pattern between letters and sounds in the language. In English, as we know, there are 44 phonemes, 44 sounds and 26 letters, but there are approximately 200 different spelling variations to represent those sounds. So we've got a few examples here to illustrate that point. So one phoneme, one sound, has a number of graphemes in the language that represent that sound. For example, the sound oo in number 1 can be spelt very differently in different words. So for example, through, few, true, boo, who. And in the second example, you have the phoneme, the sound or, and you can see the huge number of variations in the graphemes that represent that sound. So you've got floor, draw, store, saw, for, paw, or, and more. Another issue is that one grapheme can be read with a different sound. So for example, heard and beard, you have the same grapheme there, E-A-R-D, but the word is said differently, the word is read differently, and the same with lose and dose. English spelling is not as irregular as people think. There's a misconception that English is full of spelling irregularities. In actual fact, about 20% of the words in English have an irregular spelling. There is a lot more consistency and there is a lot more examples of patterns in English spelling. It's just that there's a huge variation in those patterns. So when we consider the challenges that all children face when learning to spell in English, it's important to think about the best approach in terms of teaching children how to spell. And undoubtedly, because of the huge variations in grapheme and phoneme correspondence, the teaching of spelling has to be extremely systematic and it needs to be structured. So there are 4 core principles that will help all children learn how to spell. The first is that there needs to be frequent opportunities for overlearning. There needs to be a lot of rehearsal with each new spelling pattern that is learnt. Spelling needs to be learnt in a cumulative way. So obviously children begin to learn how to read and spell as they learn phonics in reception years 1 and years 2. So with phonics, children are taught letter-sound correspondence in a very cumulative way, starting with the simplest letter-sound correspondence and gradually moving through that structure to more complicated spelling patterns. So that ties in with structured. That needs to be structured and consistent all the way through as they learn to read and write at primary school. And the last principle is that the teaching of spelling should be multisensory. So it's not just listening or looking at words and how they're spelt. It's very useful to sound them out, to write them. So different kind of sensory pathways are activated, and that will help embed the learning that's happening. Now, there are additional challenges in learning to spell for dyslexic pupils. If you haven't seen the first webinar entitled What is Dyslexia, I really recommend that you watch that because that will give you a much more detailed understanding of the features of dyslexia and how it impacts on reading and writing. But in general, dyslexic pupils will experience additional challenges when learning to read and learning to spell, because they will have some weaknesses in phonological awareness. So it's harder for dyslexic pupils to discriminate between the sounds in language. And they will have slower auditory and visual processing speed. So it'll take longer to process what they see, read as it were, and what they are writing. Working memory capacity can be reduced in many dyslexic pupils. So your working memory is your ability to manipulate information that you've stored in your short-term memory. And this impacts a lot on your learning, especially in the early stages of literacy acquisition, when a child is learning phonics, for example, and they're not fluent yet at decoding words, so they need to hold the sounds in their head in order to blend those sounds to make the word. So that is making full use of your working memory. And also retention. So retention of what you learn and how easily you can become fluent at new learning that's happening. So as I said in the previous slide, overlearning and frequent rehearsal is really important to embed the new learning that's taking place in the early stages of literacy acquisition. But this is particularly important for dyslexic pupils. We've got this example really illustrates that point. So if acquiring a skill requires 900 repetitions, a child with dyslexia might take 30 times as many repetitions. And this is a very important point when we consider the importance of intervention. So very often, wave one teaching or classroom teaching, as effective as it is, may not be sufficient in those early years to help children learn the patterns of language in English. So sometimes for some dyslexic pupils, additional intervention is needed. But the principles that we've got here apply not just to intervention, but also learning how to spell in the classroom. So daily practice is essential. And if you apply that to intervention, it's much more effective for a child to have 5 to 10 minutes of daily practice of new spellings to learn than half an hour weekly practice. Even fewer than 5 minutes on a regular basis in the classroom will be much more advantageous in the long term than an hour a week. Also, reducing the number of spellings or the number of spelling patterns that you're learning at any time makes it much easier for a child to retain what they're learning. So typically in primary school, a child may be given 10 spellings per week to learn at home, and then at the end of the week there is a spelling test. In actual fact, this is not really the most effective method to aid retention. It's much easier to have a fewer number of spellings to learn and also to ensure fluency before learning new words. So if a child has not mastered the spelling of those words, before moving on to a new set of words to learn, it's useful to practice and to continue practice spelling those words, to embed them, and then move on to a set of new words to spell. Now, precision teaching is an intervention technique that follows those principles. So if you are considering some intervention for children in your classroom, dyslexic children, then I'd recommend looking at the precision teaching webinar on the Send Success Resources page. If you're thinking about applying these principles in the classroom, then it would look something like this. So you've identified that a child in your classroom is having difficulties with silent letters. So you've got 3 words there, the words what, when, and went. So very often children spell the word went with an H because they confuse when to use the silent H. So on Monday you would teach the spelling of one word using some techniques I'm going to introduce you to. Test the child's spelling of that word. On Tuesday, assess that their spelling again. If incorrect, repeat the teaching of that word. If they've learnt it correctly, then you can discreetly teach them a new word. And then on Wednesday, you will test their spelling of those 2 words that they've learnt. Again, if they spell them incorrectly, repeat the teaching. If they've spelt them correctly, then you can introduce a new word. Thursday, you will again see if they've retained the learning of those 3 words, and the same on Friday. So you've got a far fewer number of spellings that you're teaching there, and you are consistently kind of testing their fluency on a daily basis and reteaching where necessary. So if you can discreetly teach your dyslexic pupils in this way, that will be a lot more effective than them sitting on a weekly basis and taking a test of 10 spellings. So this brings us on to a key point about cumulative learning, and that is that you should ignore age-related spelling expectations and move at the pace at which the child is learning. So, for example, especially at primary level, there are governmental expectations. There are standardised spellings that children need to learn in years 3, years 4, years 5. However, dyslexic children take longer to learn phonics-based phoneme and grapheme correspondence, and they will take longer to become fluent at learning spelling patterns. So it's important that in order to ensure that they've retained their learning, that in a sense you're moving at their pace and that they're moving cumulatively in a structured way, and that there's plenty of rehearsal before they move on to more complex spelling patterns. So the beauty of phonics is that it is very gradual, very cumulative in how it is taught. So children are first introduced to letter sounds, so vowel letter sounds, short vowels and consonants. And then there follows digraphs. So a digraph are 2 letters that make one sound. So for example, the vowel digraph A, it's 2 letters, but it's one sound. And in phonics, children will be introduced to the most common vowel and consonant digraphs that you find in language. So the beauty of phonics is that the most commonly found graphemes are introduced first. And then you have trigraphs, quadraphs. It's very difficult to find consonant quadraphs, and of course consonant blends. Now consonant blends should not be mistaken for consonant digraphs, because a consonant blend is 2 separate sounds, if you like, as in bless, you've got the b and the l, and a digraph are 2 letters that represent one sound. So I want us to think about this idea of cumulative learning, the stages of learning to read and to spell, and to consider why dyslexic children will take longer at certain stages. So the first stage, before children are at school, before they learn to read and write, is linked to phonological awareness. So the first thing that children do is they learn how to speak. And in order to learn how to speak, they are listening to sounds all the time, and then they will eventually recognize the patterns in how these, in what these sounds represent. So sounds, units of sounds make words, and those words have meaning. And dyslexic children, as we know, have a weakness with phonological awareness. So it's harder to discriminate between subtle differences between sounds. So even before learning how to spell and how to read, they may need a little bit longer to acquire fluency in speech, with some children, not all. The next stage is phonics. So with phonics, children learn that each sound has a corresponding symbol, a written symbol that represents that sound. And they will learn the simplest sounds and move on to more complex graphemes that represent sounds. So in the earlier slide, we see that you have letter sounds, moving on to digraphs and trigraphs and so on. And again, dyslexic children will need a lot more rehearsal at each stage to embed that learning, and that's linked to the challenges with phonological awareness and discriminating between sounds, and difficulties with visual discrimination. The next stage is linked to spelling conventions and spelling patterns. So at phase 6 of phonics, children are introduced to longer letter strings or patterns, if you like, spelling patterns as well. So for example, meant at the end of a word, contentment, so suspicious, mysterious. So they're starting to learn more complicated spelling patterns. At about that stage, children also become a lot more independent in how they learn spelling. So they build their own metacognitive skills. So they find their own ways of memorizing new words. And that's a really important stage as well. And some children will benefit from additional help in developing metacognitive skills to learn spelling, because not everyone learns or memorizes things in the same way. And then you have the grammar of spelling. So, for example, learning that words are spelt differently depending on where they are in a sentence. So the morphology of spelling. So, because it's really important to have a structured and cumulative approach to the teaching of spelling, it's also really important to begin any intervention at the point at which the child needs that intervention. So we ignore age-related expectations, and we need to understand at what point the child is less fluent in their understanding of spelling patterns. So if we go back to this idea of how spelling is introduced to children, the stages of phonics, then we want to use this to form the basis of any baseline assessment that we do. We should never assume that because a child is of a certain age that they have acquired certain skills in spelling. It's important that the child is secure at the earlier stages before they move on to more complex patterns. So there are lots of phonics-based spelling word lists available, and you can use this to test how secure a child is with spelling letter sounds, vowel digraphs, trigraphs, and then more complex spelling patterns. And when you notice that a child is less secure and that there are certain irregular words that they're less secure on, you will use this as the basis for any further teaching. So we've had to think about the underlying principles of effective teaching of spelling. And now I'd like us to think about individual teaching sessions and how we'd go about those. So for example, how we would deliver intervention, spelling intervention. So, when teaching spelling to dyslexic pupils, direct instruction is the most effective approach. So, direct instruction basically means the explicit teaching of a skill or concept, or in this case, a spelling. So, for example, I've identified that I need to teach the child the vowel digraph A. So, I would introduce that to the child first of all. The first stage is introducing and modelling. So I would introduce the vowel digraph, write it out, show the child examples, and so this is me explicitly teaching the new learning to the child. The next stage is that the child practices and rehearses this new concept that they're being taught. And you can do that in a number of ways to keep it interesting. So by using games, multisensory activities, and lots of rehearsal. But it's important to vary the approaches, otherwise the child will quickly become disengaged and bored, especially if they're learning the same spelling pattern again and again. The third stage is to assess and then reteach on the basis of what you've learnt from that assessment. So with precision teaching, for example, at the end of every teaching session, there is a very quick 1-minute assessment of how fluent the child is, and you will use that as a basis for your teaching in the next session. So it's not a formal test, it's just formative assessment of how much the child, how fluent the child is in what they've learnt. So when you are organising these little teaching sessions, if you like, then it's important, as I said before, to keep the actual learning interesting and engaging for the child. And there's lots of different ways that you can do that. There are some techniques, for example, simple techniques such as rainbow writing for very young primary children, whereby they're taught a new word. For example, in this case, the word swim, and the child has to first write the word and then say each sound out, each letter of the word, and then with a different coloured pen or pencil, they will trace over each letter of the word several times using different colours and sounding out each letter as they do that. So it's a little bit more interesting and engaging than simply copying out the word several times. Another technique is called the SOS spelling strategy, the simultaneous oral spelling strategy. So with this technique, you would ask the child to fold a piece of paper in half and then fold it again, and then open the piece of paper out. So in a sense, with the creases across the paper and down the paper, you're left with 4 boxes. So in box 1, you would write out the word that you're teaching the child. And as you write each letter of the word, you will sound out the word if it's phonetic, or you will say the letter of the word if it's an irregular spelling. Then in the second box, the child themselves will do this. They will write the word out and they will either say each sound as they do this, or they will repeat the letter of each word, the letter of the words. And they'll do this several times using rainbow writing, so they'll pick a new colour and they'll repeat this process over a number of times, tracing over the same letters again and again. And this will help them embed the learning of the word. And then they fold over box 1 and box 2, so they fold the paper in half so that they cannot see box 1 and box 2. And then you ask the child to write the word in box 3 from memory, again repeating each letter or each sound of the word. And finally, in box 4, they would close their eyes and attempt to write the word with their eyes closed. So this is a very multi-sensory way of them rehearsing the spelling of a word. Another very multi-sensory way of learning new spellings is to use neuro-linguistic strategies. And so essentially a neuro-linguistic strategy is one in which the child visualizes the word, and also uses a number of techniques to build a familiarity of how that word looks in their mind. So, for example, the word ought. So there's a lot of different stages there. So you might ask the child to look at the word first and to take a pretend photo. Then you would ask the child to cover the word and to visualize the word in their head, to form a mental picture. Then you can ask the child to close their eyes, to look up to the left-hand side and see the word again. So they're visualizing that word in their head. Ask them questions as they're visualizing the word. So how many letters are there in the word? Can you count them? How many of those letters are vowels? What colour are the vowels? Are there more letters before or after the vowels? So the child is still visualizing that word and then trying to pick out information from it. Are there any tall letters? Are there any descending letters? Can you say the letters in the word out loud? Could you write the word in the air? So the child will trace the word with their finger. Can you write the word joined up writing? Try spelling the word backwards. Try spelling it forwards. So you don't necessarily need to follow all of those stages, but each stage, or as many stages as possible, will help the child build a kind of sense of familiarity with that word that they're trying to learn. Another important strategy is syllabification. So again, this is very useful with multisyllabic words that are phonetically decodable. So children may need help to understand what is meant by a syllable, so you may need to explicitly teach what syllabification is, help them learn how to separate words into syllables by using clapping, for example, or tapping on the table, and then they can use that technique to help them spell words according to the individual symbols. Games can be a great way of keeping especially younger children engaged as they're rehearsing and repeating the learning of the same words again and again, maybe over a long period of time. So you can have a dice, roll out the dice, and each number of the dice corresponds with a different instruction. So again, they're doing different things but with the same word. As children get older, and so key stage 2 and beyond, they can begin to start to develop metacognitive skills. So for them to build an awareness of how they learn best and what helps them remember things. Flashcards, for example, can be a very useful way for children to record the spelling of new words that they've learnt. There are even little binders that they can use so they can keep a record of words that they learn in their intervention and refer back to those. And children can write the new words using and create prompts that will help them remember those. So one of the most effective kinds of prompts are mnemonics. So I've met a lot of dyslexic children, and many of them can remember how to spell the word because they've been taught the mnemonic. Big elephants can always upset smaller elephants. So because they've learnt that mnemonic, it's easy for them to learn how to spell the word. So help a child recognise, is it visual prompts that helps them learn and memorise words, or do they find mnemonics or song a useful way of learning how to spell? So it can also be helpful to assist children to do that. So this brings us on to the third part, which is how to mark spelling errors and how to help children when they're in a classroom, and how to help them write and develop their writing even if spelling is a challenge. So we've got an example here of some writing, and as you can see there are quite a few spelling errors. But in actual fact, this is an example of a child that's made enormous progress in their spelling. And the reason being is that many of the words there, although not entirely accurate in their spelling, are decipherable. So the first stage really in looking at spelling is to differentiate between a plausible spelling, a spelling that is accurate enough that people can decipher the word, and a word that is not really readable. So encourage the learner to see spelling accuracy as a spectrum rather than wrong and right. So for example, if a child spelt the word because as Bex, B-E-C-S, but now spells the word as B-E-C-O-S-E, they've actually made quite good progress because now the word is much closer to the actual spelling. So when you correct that word, you tick individual letters. You don't tick the whole word as wrong or right. So a child can get a sense of achievement from making progress, and they can also see that they are moving in the right direction and they've got more letters correct. When you're marking the work of a child who finds spelling very challenging, there's no point at all in correcting all of the spelling errors. This will just demoralise them, and they'll develop a fear of writing as a result. Instead, prioritise content and identify 2 or 3 spellings that need to be learnt that week and that link in with where the child is at in terms of their kind of spelling intervention, if you like. So be quite selective in the words that you choose for them to learn, and try to choose the easier words that they need to learn first rather than the more complex ones. Another key point is that if a child asks or is unaware of how to spell a word, it's not very useful to tell them to look it up in the dictionary. Certainly for dyslexic pupils, especially very young dyslexic pupils. Instead, you can help the child to spell the word independently by sounding out the syllables, or help the child kind of hear the syllables in the word and attempt to spell it themselves. Or you could give them the letters of the word and ask the child to try and put them in the correct order. Ask them to give it a go. So just give it a go and don't worry too much. Or you can write a word that rhymes with the word they've asked for, and then they can try and see if they can make a connection there and spell it independently. So the last thing I'd like us to think about is the value of assistive technology in the classroom. So I want you to imagine a child in your classroom who's brimming with ideas, and they have been given a creative writing task, and they have lots of ideas for this creative writing task. But there is a huge discrepancy between this child's ability and their ideas and their spelling ability. In situations like this, it can be an impediment for that child if they feel that they can't express what they want to write because of this weakness with spelling. So in cases such as these, I recommend that children are given access to assistive technology, and there are a number of reasons for this. Firstly, if a child word processes a written response, it can be a lot easier for them to self-check their own spellings, because a word processed written work is a lot clearer to read, and they can read through much more clearly what they've written. Very often children who are severely dyslexic or who have issues with handwriting can find it too difficult to read their own writing back, so that can be very useful. Spell check can be used in certain situations when you want the child to demonstrate their learning, and spelling accuracy is not the most important factor in these cases. So children should be given opportunities to demonstrate their skills, their learning, without this fear of spelling holding them back. So be warned that spell check isn't entirely accurate, and that there's a 30 to 70% accuracy for a number of words, but it can sometimes be a useful tool. So I advocate children alongside developing their spelling and that structured teaching of spelling, that they also are given access to assistive technology and develop their skills in word processing, because that too will be a useful and valuable skill in the future. So this brings me on to the end of the webinar. I hope some of it was useful for you. If you have any further questions about anything you've heard, or you'd like further support or resources, please do contact us at Send Success. Our email address is on our resources page, and please follow us on Send Success News, and we post regular updates of new resources that have been added to our resources page. Thank you for your time.